I'm going to begin with just a few quick co-counseling review points, just things I like to keep coming back to because they're so essential to how we do things, but they also have a way of kind of slipping away. So just a reminder, no advice in co-counseling. We don't say, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And no problem solving, which means we don't even make suggestions. And that means not even asking, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Have you tried the other thing? Those are suggestions in effect. And suggestions pressure the person. Suggestions also are kind of implied criticisms, even though they're not usually intended that way. They do send a critical message because they send a message of like, well, you should have tried these things, or why haven't you, even if we're not saying that. And so we don't even say, can I make a suggestion? Because that pressures the client to say yes and then accept the suggestion. No, have you tried this? No, have you tried that? No advice, unless it's explicitly requested by the client without the counselor having brought it up. If the client says, do you have information about this, or do you know things I'm supposed to try about this, that's up to them. They can ask that if they want. No unsolicited advice, suggestions, or problem solving. Next, a reminder that we never talk about ourselves during the other person's turn, even as a way of being supportive. So you don't say, oh, I really get what you're going through because here's what happened to me. The subject of you is off limits during your client's turn. You talk about you during your turn. The last reminder point I want to make is to take the co-counseling relationship seriously. This is a serious commitment. People are exposing important parts of themselves. They're investing themselves in this process. And that means we don't cancel sessions unless it's really an emergency. You don't cancel a session because it's like no longer convenient or you're not in the mood anymore. We don't postpone them. We don't say, oh, I'm going to have to start an hour later. Like this appointment needs to be taken as seriously as any other appointment you make. As an appointment you make for like a job interview. Like you don't miss it unless you absolutely have to. And that includes that you don't shorten it at the last minute. You don't say, I'm not really going to be able to do the full 45-minute turns. Like we're only going to have time today for half-hour turns. That's off limits unless you warn your partner about that, days ahead of time that could happen. So the main thing for today is going to be a counseling technique that involves offering the client a phrase, and I'm going to be saying a lot about it. This is going to be one of the most powerful techniques in co-counseling, and we're going to come back to it over and over and over again. We'll never stop using it. And we talked some already about fundamental counseling skills, just that really good listening, that really good support and validation. We talked in detail about the asking of good questions. The offering of a phrase is going to be the next most commonly used technique, the next most essential tool to have in our toolbox. In co-counseling, we're always trying to aim towards feelings, right? We're not much in the business of analysis. We think that analysis and insight are quite limited in how much they help. We think that actually insight comes much more from healing than the other way around. Healing, we don't think comes that much from insight. Insight helps a little, but it doesn't help that much. So we're really aimed at feelings. And the point of the short phrase is to help us get towards feelings. And we spend a lot of time in sessions talking. That's necessary. The client needs to express a lot, needs to explain what happened. That's part of how they feel connected to the counselor. That's part of how they feel like you as counselor get what they're going through. But feelings in time will tend to words in time will tend to bury our feelings. So I think of it as a certain amount of talking, a certain amount of explaining, a certain amount of storytelling moves us towards our feelings. But beyond a certain point, all that flood of words starts to carry us away from our feelings. So the object with the short phrase is to use just a much more limited number of words, a sentence or less than a sentence worth, that we say over and over again. And what I'm going to ask you to do is offer the short phrase, and I'm going to be explaining how to design that phrase. Offer the phrase to your client. How about you try saying XYZ? And the idea is for the client to say it with some force, some feeling, some passion. Then take a few deep breaths. Notice any feelings that are going on. Then say the phrase again. with that same kind of commitment to getting into the phrase, and use it many times, 4, 6, 8 tries in the session to really give it a chance to see if it will bring some feelings up. And part of the point of the phrase is to aim us not just towards feeling our feelings, but feeling them in a way where they'll be able to move through us, right? So they'll be dischargeable. And the punchiness of the phrase is part of what does that, but the content of the phrase is part of what does that, as I'll be explaining. You'll find often when you're in the counseling role that the client kind of says the phrase once and then wants to get back to talking. We have a lot of kind of inner drive to talk, feeling like that ultimately will relieve the pain that we carry around in our lives, and it won't, unfortunately. You could talk till the end of your life and the pain will still be there. But that kind of strong drive to go back to talking will often kind of get your client to say the phrase quickly and then want to go back. And so this is a time when the counselor, when you're going to want to push a little gently. Let's try this phrase again. Let's remember that the phrase is something you try multiple times. Give it another shot. Give it 4 more shots. The ultimate decision, of course, is always the client's. If they say, I'm not going there, I'm not going there. But that kind of encouragement from the counselor is going to be important to the effectiveness of the phrase. So I'm going to talk about phrases in 4 categories and how to use them. I'm going to talk about phrases that are just sum up emotion, what I call succinct statements of emotion. I'm going to talk about phrases that involve addressing absent people, pretending that people are present in the room that aren't really. I'm going to talk about phrases that reclaim power. And I'm going to talk about phrases that are actually the opposite of what the client is feeling and how we use those and why they can be helpful. So, first category of phrases that are simply succinct capturing of what the client is talking about. So, client has been explaining a bunch about a situation from her life or his life, and it all seems to revolve around a particular essence. I'm not talking about interpretation or analysis on the part of the counselor. I'm talking about just what's right there in what the client is saying. So I'm just going to make up hypotheticals. So let's say the client's been talking a bunch about early family experience, and it just keeps coming back to these situations where he or she just wasn't listened to. Like the family was just like this, as if the child weren't even there. So you start to notice this theme, and you say to your client, okay, how about you try saying, no one ever hears me? Picture yourself, back as that child. Say it like from that perspective, no one ever hears me. And get the client to try that phrase. That's a way of feeling into what the experience was like, and it's a way of zeroing in on what seems to be the kind of more the sharpest feeling, the feeling that's kind of most getting to the client as they're telling this story. If you're in the client role, it's important to consider the phrase that's being offered and adjust it to fit you better if it's not quite it. So let's say your counselor says, no one's hearing me, no one ever hears me. That might be perfect, or it might not. And if it's not quite on, then as the client you might say, well, okay, but I'm gonna make it more like you're not even noticing that I'm here. So your response to that as counselor is great. Go with that one. In other words, when the client wants to tweak it, that's almost always going to be a phrase that's going to work even better than the one you proposed. So make it work. And it might be more than a tweak. The client may need to say, well, that's not really it, actually. Actually, what the feeling was more like was like, you people have no idea what you're doing. So that's fine. Again, if it's like completely changing course, that's fine. The point is to identify a phrase that narrows it down to some key feeling. It doesn't matter if that comes from the client or the counselor. It really helps for the counselor to start proposing a phrase because, first of all, you'll often get it right. But even if you don't, it'll still actually really contribute to the process of the client being able to come up with a phrase that really fits. So succinct capturing of emotion. It can be something that's going on right now. It could be something from long ago. If it's something from earlier times in life, encourage your client to say it kind of feeling into that period. And if they're talking about something from childhood, encourage them to feel into it, saying it from the perspective of being that child. This really hurts. I feel alone. I know things that these people need to know and they're not hearing me. I'm sick of this. This has gone on for years. I'm just throwing out all different kinds of phrases that are just succinct capturing of emotions. So that's category one. The second kind of phrase is a phrase where you propose to the client some statement to direct towards somebody they've been talking about, somebody who's essential in their story. Occasionally it'll be a whole group of people. That's fine too, but usually it's going to be a particular individual. And address that person as if he or she were in the room. So clients, and I'm going to generally look at you as the counselor. Role playing, I find, is not a very effective technique. Once in a great while I use it. I don't find it works usually. So the client's actually going to turn away and sort of choose some place in the room. Imagine that the person is standing there or sitting there, the person they want to talk to, and direct what they need or needed to say to that person. It may have been something they wanted to say at the time and couldn't, or it may have been something they didn't even realize at the time they wanted to say, but now they realize it's what they really needed to express. It may be an angry feeling, it may be a sad feeling, it may be a powerful feeling, it may be a loving feeling. It could be, you should have listened to me. It should have been, you didn't know what you were talking about. It could be, I loved you so much, I wish I could have been able to tell you. It could be, you made such a difference in my life. Thank you for having been there. Sometimes it may be something that you did get to say to the person, but you also need to say it today in your session, like the feeling is going on there. There's something about talking to absent people, and again, repeatedly using a simple phrase, that is often quite powerful at getting us towards our feelings and getting us towards being able to discharge them. The temptation to turn it into a speech will come up again when you're talking to the absent person, to start saying like a book's length of stuff you wanted to express to them. So again, it's great if the counselor can say, let's go back to the phrase, zero in on one thing. So that's the second category, talking to an absent person. The third category is phrases that reclaim power. So, and some of these are kind of contained in examples that I already gave, but it's almost like reliving the situation, whatever the client's talking about, but putting a spin on it of what it would have been like if the power relations were different. So let's say we imagine back in like a childhood event or a childhood repeating event that the client is talking about, and you might have the client turn to the family member and say, you listen to me, or turn to the whole family and say, everybody shut up, I'm talking now. Obviously they couldn't have done that as a child, but now they can. And what kind of image they're going to use depends on what they find is most effective for them. They may use an image of still being that small child, but suddenly just puffed up and self-confident and powerful and loud, and everybody's a little bit intimidated. Or it may be imagining now being back in the situation as their adult self, as their large size self. That's just trial and error of what's going to turn out to be most evocative for the client, what's going to tend to most plug into those feelings. But that is another way that we reclaim power, is by switching things from childhood so that the person is now an adult, or even switching things from adulthood so somehow the power relations are completely different. It's like a fantasy game to set up. The main point is the client speaks really powerfully, imagines the situation being in this new configuration, and takes charge of the situation. We want to stay away from whining or pleading kind of tones. If you hear your client going, listen to me, come on, listen to me, you want to say, reach for commanding, not begging. Take charge. You listen to me. Listen to me. You're going to listen to me. Sometimes calmer rather than more aggressive will actually make you feel more powerful. Where the point is that brings up those feelings of power, again, going to be different in different people. So for some people, it might be like, you listen to me. And for another person, it might be like, you're going to listen to me. And you play with those and see what's going to tap into that feeling of power. The goal isn't to skip past feelings. In fact, the goal is really to be able to feel and discharge the pain of times that we were powerless. But that's much more likely to be able to happen when we use a phrase and a posture for a few minutes first that creates a sense of power. This is why people so often will have a really good cry after blasting out a bunch of anger about stuff. It's because that blasting out all that anger about stuff made them feel powerful. And then that feeling of power created a balance of attention, balancing out sometimes when they felt powerless. And now they can get a bunch of feelings to come out of them about what those feelings of powerlessness were like. And you can keep going back to the powerful yelling. Let's say I'm crying out grief or working out anger about a bunch of times when I felt completely powerless. And in the session, I'm going to keep talking in this commanding tone, and then maybe I'll go back to yelling and pounding, or I may go back to crying. And those are feelings of powerlessness that are coming out, but they're coming out, being able to come out because of the ways that we've set up this scenario of imagining powerfulness and being able to act with that kind of power. So that's category 3, is statements that reclaim power. Statements and images, using images to go with those statements to recreate a situation of what it would have been like to be able to be completely powerful. Then the 4th category is statements that are completely the opposite of what the client is actually feeling. And these can have a number of different kinds of effects. What we're typically going for with these is laughter. That's the form of discharge that's most commonly going to come out when we go after phrases that are really like totally not what it was like. So an example that I've used, I think, is the same one in the manual. Let's say that a client is talking about having grown up very poor and struggling to have enough food and struggling about their housing and really crowded in the house and anxiety about whether they're going to be okay. And you might have the client say, well, I grew up eating out of silver bowls and with servants coming in and out of the room, bringing us our meal with the amazing, tablecloth. And like, that's going to generally tend to make them laugh. It's fun. It's like the absurdity of the phrase, because it was just so not the way it was. But this can actually help with discharge sometimes. Like, it can actually get the person laughing. And because growing up with that kind of stress is extremely anxiety producing, and laughing is a key healing of anxiety. It's actually its main role, as I've talked about before. So using a phrase that's kind of ridiculous can sometimes really bring the release. Sometimes the phrase works in like a balance of attention kind of way, of being able to kind of imagine what it might be like if things were the opposite. So it could lead to other forms of discharge. It can lead to a cry, or it can lead to other ways of the feeling like the feelings are really moving through the person. So if a person is feeling just very lonely and isolated, you might have them try saying, I am so loved right now. I feel so loved, which they don't, right? That's the opposite of what they're feeling. I feel so loved right now. And some days the client will be able to somehow create an image of what that would feel like, even though that's not what life is like right now. They manage to bring the feeling in from their imagination for a minute, but because of using the phrase several times, and because you are there loving the person, and boom, suddenly a bunch of the sadness about how lonely they do feel these days is able to come out. And this is always what we're after in co-counseling. We're after trying to feel things, but we're also often feeling things that we're already feeling all the time. So the goal isn't just to feel them, but the goal is to be able to feel them in a way where they move through us rather than being stuck. And when we're at really lonely points in life, we can talk about our loneliness, and it's not usually going to be able to move through us because we're in such a lonely place. So when you have your counselor's love, that's a counter to the distress. The images you're creating, you're using your imagination to try to counter the distress, and zoom. Sometimes those feelings can start to come out. So those phrases that are totally the opposite of what the person's feeling aren't necessarily going to lead to laughter. Sometimes they'll take you to other places. Sometimes they just won't feel good to the client. And it's like, no, this phrase isn't going to work today because it is too much the opposite. It really depends. It really depends where they're at, whether they can try that. Just a reminder, like with all these other things, the point of the phrase is never to somehow get them out of the feeling. Like it's not like, oh, you're going to use this phrase about feeling loved and then you won't feel lonely anymore because you'll realize how loved you are. That's not the way we operate in co-counseling. Various other approaches would use something like that. That's not what we're after at all. We're using that phrase not to try to skip past the feelings, but to try to help them get to a place where they can feel the feelings in a way that the feelings move rather than staying stuck inside them. So I encourage you, the next time that you have a co-counseling session or the next 2 or 3 times that you have a co-counseling session, find a way when you're in the counseling role to propose a phrase. Look for the opportunity. Maybe you and your partner could even agree ahead of time before the session that you're each going to do this with each other. Sometimes it's easier in the counseling role to do something that you've kind of given each other permission to try as counselors to get past certain timidity about intervening and trying those kinds of things. But I find that when you're learning counseling techniques, they have a way of slipping away unless you practice them very soon after learning them in a co-counseling session. So try soon offering a phrase to your client, or offer 2 or 3 different phrases. Try some different wording, or bring them up at different points in the session. Maybe try from some of these different categories, and that way the technique will start to be integrated and it becomes part of your toolbox. Really essential. You'll never stop coming back to the use of the phrase as one of your central counseling tools.